The cold morning air bit through my thin jacket as I stood alone at the bus stop, watching my husband's family drive away in their rental car without so much as a backward glance. They'd left me there like discarded luggage, claiming there wasn't enough room for everyone to go to the airport together. What they didn't know was that every bus that would eventually pick me up, every route they'd taken to get around the city for the past week, every public transit vehicle they'd complained about during their visit, operated under the authority of the woman they'd just abandoned on the sidewalk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name was on every transit license, my signature on every major transportation decision, my leadership behind every improvement they'd unknowingly benefited from during their stay. They thought I was just Marcus's quiet wife who worked some mundane government job. They had no idea they were about to discover that the woman they'd been treating like an inconvenience for the past week actually controlled the entire public transportation system they relied on to get around. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 31 I've learned that being underestimated can be both a burden and a strategic advantage. For the past 5 years I've served as the executive director of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, overseeing a transportation network that serves over 2 million passengers daily across our sprawling metropolitan area. It's a position that requires constant decision-making, crisis management, and the ability to balance competing interests from city officials, union representatives, environmental groups, and the riding public. Most people hear government job and immediately assume I'm some mid-level bureaucrat shuffling papers in a windowless office, which is exactly what my husband Marcus's family has believed since the day we met. The irony isn't lost on me that the people who've spent years dismissing my career as boring and insignificant have been completely dependent on the systems I've built and maintained. Every time they visit our city, they use the buses, trains, and transit hubs that exist because of policies I've implemented and improvements I've championed. When they complain about delays or service interruptions, they're essentially critiquing my work without realizing it. When they praise the new electric buses or the renovated subway stations, they're admiring the results of initiatives I've personally overseen. Yet somehow in their minds I remain the quiet little wife who managed to snag their successful son and probably doesn't contribute much to our household beyond keeping house and looking pleasant at family gatherings. Marcus knows I work for the Transit Authority, of course, but like most people outside the transportation industry, he's never fully grasped the scope of what my position entails. When people ask what his wife does for work, he usually says something vague about me working in public transportation or city planning, his tone suggesting that it's not particularly important or interesting. He's never shown much curiosity about the details of my job, the challenges I face, or the accomplishments I'm proud of. In 5 years of marriage, he's never once attended one of my speaking engagements at urban planning conferences, never visited my office to see the command center where we monitor the entire transit network in real time, never asked to meet the team of engineers and planners who help me keep this massive system running smoothly. This isn't entirely his fault, I suppose. I've always been someone who prefers to let my work speak for itself rather than constantly promoting my achievements or demanding recognition. My parents raised me to believe that competence and dedication would eventually be noticed and rewarded, that good work didn't need to be accompanied by fanfare or self-promotion. My grandmother, who immigrated to this country with nothing and built a successful small business through sheer determination, taught me that the most powerful people are often the ones who don't feel the need to constantly remind others of their power. She used to say that truly confident people let their results do their talking for them. But somewhere along the way, my natural inclination toward modesty and my preference for behind-the-scenes leadership created a situation where the people closest to me began to see me as less capable and interesting than I actually was. Marcus's family formed their opinions about me based on my quiet demeanor and my reluctance to dominate conversations with stories about my professional life. They decided I was probably overwhelmed by their son's success and grateful to have married into a family with higher social standing than my own background would typically provide access to. The truth is quite different. My position as executive director puts me in regular contact with mayors, governors, federal transportation officials, and business leaders across multiple industries. I've testified before Congress about infrastructure funding priorities, spoken at international conferences about sustainable urban transportation, and been featured on the cover of Transportation Weekly magazine as one of the 40 under 40 leaders shaping the future of public transit. My annual salary, which Marcus knows about but apparently hasn't shared with his family, is actually higher than his income as a software engineer, though I've never felt the need to make that fact known in any obvious way. The disconnect between how Marcus's family perceives me and who I actually am became most apparent during their recent week-long visit to our city. They'd come for Marcus's birthday celebration, planning to stay in our guest room and take advantage of all the cultural attractions and entertainment options our metropolitan area has to offer. From the moment they arrived, I could sense their familiar pattern of treating me like a peripheral figure in their family dynamic, someone to be polite to but not necessarily included in the real conversations or decision-making processes. Marcus's mother, Patricia, is the kind of woman who spent her entire life believing that her opinions about everything from restaurant choices to political candidates carry special weight because she's never encountered many situations where her confidence was seriously challenged. She's lived in the same small suburban town for 30 years, raised 3 children who all turned out reasonably successful, and considers herself an expert on urban living despite rarely venturing into cities larger than the county seat near her home. From the moment she stepped off the plane, she had opinions about our city's public transportation that she felt compelled to share, usually in the form of complaints about crowded buses or criticism of route efficiency. Marcus's father, Robert, is a retired electrician who takes pride in his practical knowledge and his ability to identify problems with infrastructure and systems wherever he goes. He's the type of man who believes that common sense and working-class wisdom are more valuable than formal education or technical expertise, which puts him at odds with much of what I represent professionally. Throughout their visit, he made frequent comments about government waste and bureaucratic inefficiency, usually while looking directly at me as if I were personally responsible for every suboptimal aspect of public sector operations he'd ever encountered. Marcus's sister, Jessica, brought along her husband David and their 2 teenage children, creating a group dynamic where I was consistently outnumbered by people who shared family history, inside jokes, and a collective skepticism about city living that I was expected to tolerate with good humor. Jessica works in retail management and has strong opinions about customer service standards, which she applied liberally to her experience using our city's public transportation during their visit. David sells insurance in their hometown and approaches every new experience through the lens of risk assessment and cost-benefit analysis, usually concluding that whatever we were doing could be done more efficiently or more cheaply somewhere else. The teenagers, Kevin and Michelle, were actually the most diplomatic members of the group, probably because they were genuinely curious about city life and hadn't yet developed their parents' reflexive criticism of anything unfamiliar. They asked thoughtful questions about the subway system and seemed impressed by the technology and coordination required to move so many people around efficiently. Their enthusiasm for exploring the city via public transit was refreshing, even as their parents complained about everything from the crowds to the noise to the cost of day passes. The first sign that this visit was going to be particularly challenging came during their second day in town, when Patricia announced that she'd researched the most efficient routes for visiting the art museum, the botanical gardens, and the historic district, all in a single day. She'd spent the evening before studying transit maps and schedules, which should have been encouraging, but her conclusions about the system's limitations and inefficiencies made it clear that she viewed public transportation as a necessary evil rather than an impressive logistical achievement. "Sarah," she said over breakfast, spreading printed maps across our dining table, "I don't understand why the city doesn't run more direct routes between major attractions. It seems like poor planning to make tourists transfer between buses just to get from the museum to the garden. In our town, we'd never design a system that was so inconvenient for visitors." I explained that the hub-and-spoke design with strategic transfer points actually allows us to serve many more destinations efficiently than a system of direct routes between every possible pair of locations. But Patricia wasn't interested in the mathematical principles behind network design. She'd made up her mind that the system was flawed, and my attempt to explain the reasoning behind our decisions only reinforced her perception that I was making excuses for poor planning rather than helping her understand the complexity of urban transportation logistics. Robert chimed in with his own critique, focused on what he saw as maintenance issues with some of the older buses and subway cars they'd encountered. In my line of work, he said with the authority of someone who'd spent decades troubleshooting electrical problems, when equipment isn't performing up to standard, you fix it or replace it. You don't just let passengers deal with uncomfortable seats and broken air conditioning because it's too expensive to maintain things properly. I could have explained our systematic fleet replacement program, our preventive maintenance protocol, or the budget constraints that require us to balance service quality with fiscal responsibility. But I'd learned over the years that Robert interpreted detailed explanations as evidence that someone was overcomplicating simple problems. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I nodded politely and suggested that they might be more comfortable taking rideshare services for longer trips, which prompted Jessica to lecture me about the environmental impact of private vehicles and the importance of supporting public transportation, even when it wasn't perfectly convenient. The pattern continued throughout their visit, with Marcus's family treating every aspect of their public transit experience as an opportunity to critique the system I'd dedicated my career to improving. When buses ran slightly behind schedule due to traffic congestion, they complained about unreliable service without considering the external factors that make precise timing impossible in urban environments. When subway cars were crowded during peak hours, they grumbled about overcrowding without acknowledging that high ridership is actually a sign of a successful transit system. When they encountered construction-related detours, they assumed these were evidence of poor planning rather than necessary infrastructure improvement. Marcus, who should have been defending my work or at least helping his family understand that their criticisms were directed at his wife's professional expertise, mostly remained silent during these conversations. Occasionally he'd make vague comments about city systems being complicated, but he never explicitly connected their transit complaints to my role in managing the very network they were criticizing. His silence felt like tacit agreement with their critiques, as if he too believed that the problems they identified were evidence of institutional failure rather than the inevitable challenges that come with operating complex urban infrastructure. The situation became more personally painful when their complaints shifted from general criticisms of the transit system to more specific attacks on government employees and bureaucrats. Robert, in particular, seemed to enjoy making sweeping statements about public sector workers being overpaid and underproductive, usually while looking directly at me as if I were a prime example of the problem he was describing. Patricia would nod along with these observations, occasionally adding her own thoughts about how private companies would never tolerate the inefficiencies she perceived in government operations. The problem with government jobs, Robert said during one particularly uncomfortable dinner conversation, is that there's no real accountability. In the private sector, if you don't perform, but government workers can coast along doing the minimum because there's no competition and no consequences for mediocrity. He gestured with his fork as if making a point that was both obvious and profound, apparently unaware that his daughter-in-law was responsible for managing performance standards across one of the largest transit agencies in the country. Jessica agreed enthusiastically, adding her own perspective from retail management. Exactly. In my store, if customer satisfaction drops, we have to figure out what's wrong and fix it immediately. But with government services, people are stuck with whatever quality they provide because there's no alternative. It breeds complacency. I sat there listening to this conversation, feeling the familiar mixture of frustration and disbelief that had characterized so many interactions with Marcus's family over the years. They were literally describing my job responsibilities: ensuring accountability, maintaining performance standards, responding to customer feedback, managing budget constraints, while simultaneously dismissing the possibility that anyone in my position could be competent or dedicated. The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't been so personally insulting. Marcus made occasional half-hearted attempts to change the subject, but he never directly challenged his family's assumptions or pointed out that their criticisms might be unfair or uninformed. His reluctance to defend me or my profession sent a clear message to his family that their opinions were acceptable and that I was either too polite or too powerless to object to their characterizations of government work. The breaking point came on their final full day in the city when Marcus's family decided to make a trip to the airport to send some souvenirs back home rather than pack them in their luggage. They were scheduled to fly out the next morning, and Patricia had apparently calculated that shipping costs would be lower than airline baggage fees for the extra items they'd accumulated during their visit. The plan was for everyone to go together, taking advantage of our car to avoid dealing with public transportation while carrying packages. I had been looking forward to this final group outing, thinking it might provide an opportunity for more pleasant interactions as we wrapped up their visit. Instead, it became the most hurtful demonstration yet of how little my presence meant to Marcus's family and how willing my husband was to prioritize their comfort over my inclusion. We were all gathered in our living room, preparing to leave for the airport, when Patricia suddenly looked around the group and announced that there might not be enough room in our sedan for everyone to ride comfortably. "Let's see," she said, counting on her fingers. "That's Robert and me, Jessica and David, Kevin and Michelle, Marcus. That's 7 people plus all these packages. Sarah, honey, would you mind terribly if you stayed behind? I know it's not the most exciting trip anyway, and this way everyone else will have enough space to be comfortable." The casual way she excluded me from the family outing, as if my presence was optional rather than expected, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a situation where space was genuinely limited. Our car was large enough to accommodate everyone, even with packages. This was Patricia making a deliberate choice about whose company was most valuable, and she'd decided that I ranked last on that list. Marcus looked uncomfortable but didn't immediately object to his mother's suggestion. Jessica and David were already gathering their packages, apparently comfortable with the arrangement. The teenagers seemed confused by the sudden change in plans, but weren't assertive enough to question their grandmother's decision. Robert was checking his phone, apparently unconcerned with who went or stayed, as long as the logistics worked out efficiently. "Actually," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I was looking forward to the drive. I don't mind being a little crowded if it means we can all go together." Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that was meant to look considerate, but felt patronizing instead. "Oh, that's sweet of you, dear, but honestly, there's not much to see at the airport anyway. You'd probably be bored sitting in the car while we run our errands. This way you can relax at home and maybe get some cleaning done before we leave tomorrow." The suggestion that I should use this time to clean up after their visit, as if I were the hired help rather than the hostess, was the final insult in a week full of casual dismissals. But what hurt more than Patricia's thoughtless comment was Marcus's continued silence. He was looking at me with an expression that might have been apologetic, but he wasn't speaking up to insist that his wife be included in the family outing. He was choosing the path of least resistance, avoiding conflict with his mother even if it meant abandoning his wife. "I think there's plenty of room," I said more firmly, making one last attempt to assert my right to be included. "We've all fit in the car before for other trips this week." "Well, yes, but this time we have all these packages," Patricia replied, as if that settled the matter. "And honestly, Sarah, you've been so quiet this whole visit. I wasn't sure you were really enjoying our family activities anyway. I thought you might prefer some alone time." The comment about my being quiet, delivered with the kind of false concern that barely disguised criticism, perfectly encapsulated everything that was wrong with my relationship with Marcus's family. They'd created a dynamic where my attempts to be a considerate and accommodating hostess were interpreted as disinterest, where my preference for listening rather than dominating conversations was seen as evidence that I didn't belong in their group. They'd decided I was an outsider, and now they were using that characterization to justify excluding me from activities. Marcus finally spoke up, but his words were disappointing rather than supportive. "Mom, I'm sure we can make room for everyone," he said weakly, but then immediately undercut his own statement by adding, "Though if Sarah doesn't mind staying home, it would be more comfortable for everyone else." The phrase "if Sarah doesn't mind" was particularly galling because it put the burden on me to either accept exclusion gracefully or look like I was being difficult by insisting on inclusion. It was a perfect example of how Marcus consistently avoided taking strong positions that might create tension with his family, even when doing so meant failing to support his wife. "Of course she doesn't mind," Patricia said quickly, as if the matter were settled. "Sarah's always so understanding about these things. That's one of the qualities we admire about her. She's never demanding or difficult." Being praised for my willingness to accept poor treatment felt worse than direct criticism would have. Patricia was essentially acknowledging that they routinely excluded me from family activities, and that they appreciated my compliance with this arrangement. The fact that she saw my accommodation as a positive character trait, rather than recognizing it as evidence of their own thoughtlessness, revealed just how little consideration they gave to my feelings or desire. As Marcus's family gathered their belongings and headed toward the door, I felt a familiar sense of invisibility settling over me. This was the same feeling I'd experienced at family dinners, where conversations flowed around me without ever including me. At holiday gatherings, where gift exchanges somehow forgot to account for my presence. At birthday celebrations, where my contributions were acknowledged with polite thank yous, before attention quickly moved to more important matters. But standing in my own living room, watching my husband prepare to leave with his family for an outing I'd been deliberately excluded from, I felt something shift inside me. The rational part of my mind understood that this was a relatively minor incident in the grand scheme of our relationship, but something about the casualness of their dismissal and Marcus's willingness to go along with it crystallized years of accumulated frustration and hurt. These people had spent an entire week in my city, using transportation systems I'd designed and managed, criticizing decisions I'd made, dismissing work I'd dedicated my career to perfecting, and characterizing government employees like me as lazy and unaccountable. They'd accepted my hospitality while making it clear that they didn't particularly value my company. They'd allowed me to cook for them, clean up after them, and accommodate their preferences while treating me like a helpful but ultimately insignificant presence in their family dynamic. And now they were leaving me behind for their final group activity, confident that I would accept this treatment with the same grace and understanding I'd shown throughout their visit. They expected me to wave goodbye from the doorway, and then use my alone time to tidy up their messes, ensuring that everything would be clean and organized for their departure the next morning. What they didn't understand was that the quiet, accommodating woman they'd been taking for granted was the same person who controlled every aspect of the transportation infrastructure they depended on to navigate the city. The mild-mannered government employee they'd been dismissing as boring and insignificant was actually one of the most powerful people in municipal government, someone whose decisions affected millions of residents and visitors every single day. As I watched them pile into our car, my car registered to the woman they'd just left standing alone on the sidewalk, I thought about all the ways their week in the city had been shaped by systems and policies I'd implement. The real-time arrival information at bus stops that had helped them plan their trips came from technology upgrades I'd championed against considerable political resistance. The new electric buses they'd ridden downtown were part of an environmental initiative I'd spent 2 years developing and defending to skeptical city council members. The renovated subway stations they'd photographed for their social media posts were the result of capital improvement programs I'd designed and overseen. Even their complaints about the transit system were in many ways complaints about my professional decisions and leadership. When they criticized route efficiency, they were critiquing network designs I'd approved. When they grumbled about crowded conditions, they were responding to service levels I'd set based on budget constraints and ridership projection. When they encountered delays or detours, they were experiencing the real-world consequences of infrastructure management decisions that crossed my desk every single day. The irony of the situation would have been amusing if it hadn't been so personally painful. Here was a family that had spent a week dependent on systems I controlled, complaining about policies I'd implemented, and dismissing the competence of people like me, all while treating me as if I were too insignificant to merit inclusion in their final family outing. But as I stood there watching their car disappear down our street, I realized that I had more power in this situation than they could possibly imagine. They were heading to an airport served by buses and trains that operated under my authority. Their flight tomorrow morning would depart from a facility that relied on ground transportation connections I'd designed and managed. They would need public transit or ride-share services to navigate the city, all of which operated within regulatory frameworks I'd helped establish and maintain. For years I'd kept my professional identity separate from my role as Marcus's wife, partly because I believed that relationships should be based on personal connection rather than professional status, partly because I'd been raised to let my work speak for itself rather than using my position to demand respect or recognition. But watching my husband drive away with his family, leaving me alone after a week of casual dismissal and criticism, I began to wonder if my discretion had been wisdom or simply enabling behavior that was fundamentally disrespectful. I thought about my grandmother, who had taught me that true strength came from competence and character rather than displays of power or authority. She'd built her business by focusing on quality and service, letting satisfied customers spread word of her reliability and skill rather than promoting herself aggressively. Her approach had worked in a small community where long-term relationships and reputation mattered more than immediate recognition or flashy demonstrations of success. But standing alone in my living room, feeling the weight of years of accumulated dismissal and casual disrespect, I began to consider whether my grandmother's lessons needed to be adapted for different circumstances. Perhaps there were situations where allowing people to underestimate you became enabling them to treat you poorly. Perhaps there were times when refusing to claim your authority and expertise became a disservice not just to yourself, but to the work you dedicated your life to accomplishing. I spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about the week that had just passed and the patterns of behavior I'd been accepting from Marcus's family for years. Their visit had crystallized everything that was wrong with our family dynamic: their casual dismissal of my contribution, their assumption that their opinions about urban planning and government efficiency were more valuable than my professional expertise, their willingness to criticize systems I'd designed while treating me as if I were too insignificant to defend my own work. More troubling was Marcus's role in perpetuating these dynamics. His failure to connect his family's transit complaints to my professional responsibilities suggested either a fundamental lack of understanding about what my job entailed, or a deliberate choice to avoid creating conflicts that might force his family to reconsider their opinions about me. Either way, his silence in the face of their criticism felt like a betrayal of our partnership and a failure to value the work that had become central to my identity and sense of purpose. As evening approached, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my marriage allowing Marcus's family to dismiss and disrespect me while remaining ignorant of who they were actually dealing with. I wasn't going to continue pretending that their casual cruelty was acceptable or that I deserved to be excluded from family activities because my presence wasn't particularly valued. Tomorrow morning, Marcus's family would discover that the quiet government employee they'd been taking for granted was actually the person responsible for every aspect of the transportation system they'd been criticizing all week. They would learn that their casual dismissal of bureaucratic competence had been directed at someone whose decisions affected millions of people and whose expertise was recognized by colleagues across the country and around the world. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for James Rodriguez, the Director of Operations for our Airport Ground Transportation Division. James had been with the Transit Authority for 15 years and had worked his way up from bus driver to management through a combination of technical skill and natural leadership ability. He was one of the people I trusted most to handle sensitive situations with professionalism and discretion. "Good evening, Director Chen," James answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the same respectful tone that characterized all of our professional interactions. "I hope you're having a pleasant weekend." "Thank you, James. I'm sorry to bother you on a Sunday evening, but I have a situation that requires some special coordination tomorrow morning." I explained that I had family members departing from the airport who had been critical of our transit services throughout their visit, and that I wanted to ensure they experienced the full range of what our system could provide when properly coordinated. "I'd like you to personally oversee their departure experience tomorrow," I continued. "Make sure they understand that their transportation arrangements are being managed by Transit Authority leadership, and arrange for them to receive the kind of VIP treatment we typically reserve for visiting dignitaries or major donors. James was quiet for a moment, probably processing the unusual nature of my request. In 5 years as director, I'd never asked for special treatment for family members or used my position to provide personal favor. My reputation for maintaining strict boundaries between my professional and personal life was well established throughout the organization. Of course, Director Chen. Could you provide me with their flight details and the specific kind of experience you'd like us to create for them? I gave him Marcus's family's departure information and outlined the level of service I wanted them to receive. James, I want them to understand that these arrangements are being provided specifically because they've been traveling with Sarah Chen, Director of the Metropolitan Transit Authority. Make sure they comprehend the connection between their week of transit experiences and the person who's been responsible for managing and improving those systems. And Director Chen, should I coordinate with airport administration to ensure that other aspects of their departure experience reflect their connection to transit authority leadership? The suggestion was diplomatically phrased, but I understood what James was offering. The airport administration worked closely with our ground transportation division, and they would be happy to provide additional courtesies to family members of someone in my position. The prospect of Marcus's family receiving truly VIP treatment from multiple city agencies, while learning that all of this attention was connected to the woman they'd been dismissing all week, was incredibly appealing. Yes, please coordinate whatever you think would be appropriate. I want them to have an experience that reflects the level of service we provide when people understand who they're dealing with. After ending the call with James, I spent the rest of the evening reviewing my schedule for the next day and preparing for what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation with Marcus when he returned from the airport. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of a situation rather than simply accommodating other people's preferences and assumptions. Tomorrow would be very interesting indeed. Marcus returned home around 9 o'clock that evening, looking tired and slightly guilty as he walked through our front door. I was sitting in the living room reading transportation policy reports, something I often did on weekend evenings but which had taken on new significance given the events of the day. He dropped his keys on the side table with the kind of heavy sigh that suggested he knew we needed to have a conversation he wasn't looking forward to. "How was the airport?" I asked without looking up from my reading, keeping my voice neutral and professional in a way that I knew would signal to him that something had shifted in my mood. "Fine," he said, settling into the chair across from me with obvious reluctance. "Mom got all her packages." Dad complained about the airport layout for about 20 minutes. The kids bought overpriced snacks from the vending machines. Pretty standard family outing, I guess. The casual way he described their trip, as if it had been just another ordinary family activity rather than an outing I'd been deliberately excluded from, irritated me more than his actual participation in leaving me behind. It suggested that he either didn't understand why I might be upset, or was hoping that treating the incident as insignificant would make it disappear without requiring him to examine his own behavior. "I'm glad everyone had a good time," I said, finally looking up from my reports to meet his eye. "It sounds like you made the right choice about who should go and who should stay home." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the edge in my voice but apparently unsure how to respond to it. "Sarah, about that, I know you were disappointed about not coming with us. I should have spoken up more when Mom suggested you stay behind." "Should have spoken up more," I repeated, testing the weight of his words. "That's an interesting way to put it. As if you spoke up at all, which we both know you didn't." He ran his hands through his hair in the gesture I'd learned to recognize as his response to feeling cornered. "I was trying to avoid creating conflict. You know how my family can be when there's disagreement. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I just went along with Mom's suggestion." "Easier for everyone except your wife, you mean?" "That's not fair, Sarah. You know I value you and our marriage. This was just one afternoon. And honestly, I didn't think you'd be that upset about missing a trip to the airport. It's not like we were going somewhere exciting or doing something you'd particularly enjoy." The fact that he still didn't understand why being excluded was hurtful regardless of the destination suggested that we had much deeper problems in our marriage than I'd previously realized. Marcus was an intelligent man who could grasp complex technical concepts in his work as a software engineer, but he seemed completely unable to understand the emotional dynamics of inclusion and exclusion within his own family. "Marcus, I said carefully. Let me ask you something. In the 5 years we've been married, how many times has your family planned activities that somehow didn't include me? He looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if he'd never considered the pattern of my exclusion as a deliberate phenomenon rather than a series of unrelated coincidences. I don't know. I mean, it's not like they deliberately exclude you. Sometimes there are just practical limitations or scheduling conflicts. Really? Because I can think of at least a dozen examples off the top of my head. Your cousin's wedding shower that I wasn't invited to because it was family only, even though spouses of other cousins were there. The fishing trip your dad organized that was supposedly too rustic for wives, except Jessica. The surprise birthday party for your grandmother that I only found out about after the fact because someone assumed you'd tell me even though you weren't actually invited to bring me. As I listed these incidents, I could see Marcus's expression changing from defensive confusion to uncomfortable recognition. These weren't isolated events that he could dismiss as misunderstandings or practical limitations. They were part of a consistent pattern of his family treating me as optional rather than integral to their family gatherings. I never thought about it that way, he said quietly. I guess I just assumed that when you didn't complain about missing things, it meant you weren't really interested in going anyway. And it never occurred to you to ask me whether I was interested. It never seemed strange to you that your wife was consistently left out of family activity. It never made you wonder whether I was hurt by being excluded but too polite to say anything. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, apparently processing the implications of what I was saying. Sarah, I'm sorry, I really am. I can see now that my family hasn't treated you fairly, and I should have done more to make sure you were included. But you have to understand, confronting my family about these things is really difficult for me. They're not intentionally mean people, they just have their ways of doing things, and changing those patterns requires conversations that nobody really wants to have. The phrase "conversations that nobody really wants to have" perfectly encapsulated everything that was wrong with Marcus's approach to our marriage. He was admitting that protecting his family's comfort was more important to him than defending his wife's dignity. He was essentially saying that avoiding difficult conversations with his parents and sister mattered more than ensuring that I felt valued and included in our extended family. So your solution has been to let me absorb the hurt and disappointment rather than risk making your family uncomfortable by insisting that they treat your wife with basic consideration. When you put it like that, it sounds terrible, he admitted. But family dynamics are complicated, and I've never been good at navigating conflict. I keep hoping that if I give everyone enough time, these issues will resolve themselves naturally. Marcus, we've been married for 5 years. How much more time were you planning to give this situation to resolve itself? He couldn't answer that question, probably because he'd never actually expected the situation to change. In his mind, I suspect he'd categorized my exclusion from family activities as an unfortunate but manageable aspect of our marriage. Something we could work around rather than something that needed to be fixed. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. I can't go back and change how today went, but I can try to do better in the future. I can talk to my family about being more inclusive. What I want, I said, standing up from my chair and gathering my policy reports, is for you to understand that this isn't just about family dynamics or inclusion in social activities. This is about respect and recognition of who I am as a person. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking back at my husband, who still seemed confused about the depth of the problem we were facing. Marcus, your family spent an entire week in this city complaining about the public transportation system, criticizing government efficiency, and making disparaging comments about bureaucrats and public sector employees. Did it ever occur to you that they were essentially insulting my profession and my life's work? He blinked at me as if this connection had genuinely never crossed his mind. I mean, they were just expressing frustration with some inconveniences they experienced. I don't think they meant it personally. They were criticizing decisions that I make every day, policies that I've implemented, and systems that I've spent years improving. When your father complained about government waste and inefficiency while looking directly at me, he was essentially calling me lazy and incompetent to my face. When your mother criticized our route planning, she was dismissing expertise that I've spent my entire career developing. And when you sat there and said nothing, you were sending the message that their opinions were more valid than my professional knowledge. The look of dawning comprehension on Marcus's face suggested that he was finally beginning to understand the personal nature of his family's critique. Sarah, I had no idea you were taking their comments so personally. I thought you understood that they were just frustrated with some aspects of their experience, not making judgments about your work specifically. How could they be making judgments about my work specifically, when they don't even know what my work involves? I asked. That's exactly the problem, Marcus. Your family has formed opinions about me and my profession based on complete ignorance about what I actually do, or how successful I've been at doing it. I continued up the stairs, leaving Marcus sitting alone in the living room, to think about what I'd said. I needed space to process my own emotions, and to prepare for what would happen the next morning when his family attempted to leave for the airport and discovered that their transportation arrangements had been personally managed by the woman they'd been dismissing all week. That night, I lay awake thinking about the conversation I'd had with Marcus and the pattern of behavior it had revealed. His family's treatment of me wasn't just thoughtless or accidentally exclusive. It was rooted in fundamental assumptions about my worth and capabilities that Marcus had never challenged or corrected. They'd decided that I was a quiet, unremarkable person who was lucky to have married into their family, and they'd interpreted my professional discretion and personal modesty as evidence that their assessment was accurate. What bothered me most was Marcus's admission that he'd been aware of these dynamics, but had chosen not to address them because doing so would require difficult conversations with his family. He'd essentially sacrificed my dignity and sense of belonging to maintain his own comfort and avoid potential conflict with his parents and sister. That wasn't the behavior of a partner, it was the behavior of someone who prioritized his family of origin over his chosen family. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to fit into Marcus's family dynamic, accommodating their preferences, accepting their casual exclusions, and listening politely to their criticisms of things I cared deeply about. I'd told myself that their behavior reflected ignorance rather than malice, that given enough time they would come to appreciate my qualities and include me more naturally in their family activity. Instead, their treatment of me had become more dismissive over time, as if my acceptance of their exclusion had confirmed their initial assessment that I wasn't particularly important or interesting. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent light rain that makes travel unpleasant, but not impossible. I woke early and spent time reviewing the arrangements James had made for Marcus's family's departure, making sure that every detail reflected the level of service we provided to dignitaries and VIP travelers. Their experience today would demonstrate what public transportation could look like when managed by competent professionals with adequate resources and clear authority. Marcus was already awake when I came downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and looking like he'd slept as poorly as I had. His family was scheduled to depart our house at 8:30 for their 11 o'clock flight, which meant we had about an hour before they would discover that their final day in the city would be very different from what they were expecting. "Good morning," I said, pouring myself coffee and settling at the table across from him. "Are you ready for your family's big departure day?" "Sarah, about last night," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Marcus, we can continue that conversation later. Right now, I want you to understand that today is going to be educational for everyone involved." He looked confused by my tone, which was more cheerful than he'd probably expected given our discussion the previous evening. "What do you mean, education?" "I mean that your family is going to have some new experiences today that will help them understand a few things they didn't know before." Before Marcus could ask for clarification, we heard the sound of luggage wheels and voices in the hallway outside our apartment. His family was preparing for their departure, probably gathering their belongings and reviewing their travel plans one final time. In a few minutes, they would knock on our door expecting a simple goodbye and a ride to the nearest transit station. "Sarah," Marcus said urgently, "what exactly have you arranged for today?" "Nothing dramatic," I assured him. "I've just made sure that your family receives the level of service that reflects their connection to me. It's time they understood who they've been dealing with all week." Patricia's knock on our door was brisk and businesslike, the sound of someone who was ready to complete the final logistics of their visit and move on to the next phase of their travel. Marcus opened the door to find his entire family standing in the hallway with their luggage, looking tired but organized for their journey home. "Good morning, everyone," Patricia said with forced cheerfulness. "We're all packed and ready to go. Marcus, are you ready to drive us to the train station?" "Actually," I said, stepping forward before Marcus could respond, "I've arranged alternative transportation for you this morning." something more appropriate for your departure. Jessica looked puzzled. Alternative transportation. Sarah, we already researched the best route to the airport. The Blue Line train from downtown connects directly to the airport terminal. It's the most efficient option. I'm sure it is, I agreed. But today you'll be experiencing a different level of service, something that better reflects your status as special guests in our city. Robert frowned at the word special. Probably suspicious of anything that sounded like it might involve additional expense or complicated arrangement. Sarah, we appreciate the thought, but we're perfectly capable of taking regular public transportation to the airport. We don't need any special treatment. Of course you don't need it, I said pleasantly, but you're going to receive it anyway. Your transportation arrangements have been personally coordinated by the Metropolitan Transit Authority to ensure that your departure experience reflects the importance of your visit. David, who had been checking his phone for traffic updates, looked up with interest. The Transit Authority. Why would they be involved in our travel arrangements? Because, I said, maintaining my pleasant tone while watching their faces carefully, they wanted to ensure that the family of Sarah Chen, the executive director of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, received the level of service we typically reserve for visiting dignitaries and municipal VIP guests. The silence that followed my statement was profound and complete. I watched as the information processed across their faces, each person reaching understanding at slightly different speed. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Robert stopped shuffling through his travel documents and stared at me as if I'd just announced that I was a different person entirely. Jessica and David exchanged glances that suggested they were both wondering if they'd heard me correctly. Marcus looked uncomfortable but not surprised, which confirmed my suspicion that he'd known more about the scope of my professional responsibilities than he'd ever shared with his family. The teenagers, Kevin and Michelle, looked confused but interested, probably trying to understand why this announcement was causing such dramatic reactions from the adults. Executive Director, Patricia repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made sense. Sarah, what exactly does that mean? It means, I explained patiently, that I'm responsible for managing the entire public transportation network that serves this metropolitan area. Every bus, train, subway car and transit facility operates under my administrative authority. The system you've been using and critiquing all week reports to me. Jessica was the first to fully grasp the implications of what I was saying. When we complained about the bus routes being inefficient, or the subway cars being crowded, or the maintenance issues we noted, you were critiquing my professional decisions and management policies. I finished. Yes, exactly. Robert, who had spent considerable time during their visit explaining how government bureaucrats were overpaid and underproductive, looked particularly uncomfortable with this revelation. Sarah, I had no idea you held such a senior position. When Marcus said you worked for the Transit Authority, I assumed you meant something more at entry level. I know what you assumed, I said calmly. The question is why you felt comfortable making disparaging comments about government employees and bureaucratic inefficiency, without ever asking what my actual job responsibilities were. Patricia was clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with her preconceived notions about my capabilities and importance. But you never mentioned being in charge of anything. You always seemed so modest about your work. I am modest about my work, I agree. I believe in letting results speak for themselves, rather than demanding recognition or respect based on titles and authority. Unfortunately, that approach sometimes allows people to make incorrect assumptions about competence and value. David, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. Sarah, if you're really the director of the Transit Authority, that means you're basically running a billion-dollar operation with thousands of employees. $7 billion annually, actually, and approximately 12,000 employees across operations, maintenance, planning, and administration. I corrected. But yes, you have the general idea. The numbers seemed to have a physical impact on Marcus's family, as if the scale of my responsibilities was too large for them to process easily. They'd spent a week treating me like someone whose opinions about transportation policy were less valuable than their tourist observations, only to discover that I was actually the person who made those policies and implemented those systems. Marcus stepped forward, looking like he wanted to manage the situation before it became more uncomfortable for his family. Mom, Dad, I know this is surprising. But Marcus, I interrupted gently, I think your family is capable of processing this information without your help. In fact, I think it would be better if they had the opportunity to ask questions and understand the full scope of what they've learned. Patricia, who was clearly still struggling with the revelation, asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. Sarah, why didn't you tell us about your position? Why let us think you had some ordinary government job? Because I wanted to see how you would treat me when you thought I was just Marcus's quiet wife with an unremarkable career. I replied honestly. I wanted to understand whether you valued me as a person, or whether your opinion of me was dependent on my professional status and authority. The implications of my statement settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They were beginning to understand that their behavior toward me throughout the week had been a test of their character, and they were realizing that they hadn't performed particularly well. And what did you learn? Jessica asked quietly, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. I learned that you're capable of dismissing and excluding someone based entirely on assumptions about their worth and capabilities. I learned that you can spend an entire week dependent on systems created and managed by someone while simultaneously criticizing their competence and value. And I learned that Marcus would rather allow his wife to be treated poorly than risk creating conflict with his family. The last comment hit Marcus particularly hard, and I could see him struggling with the recognition that his passivity had been more harmful than he'd realized. His family was also processing the uncomfortable truth that their behavior toward me had been consistently dismissive and exclusionary, based on nothing more than my quiet demeanor and their assumptions about government work. Before anyone could respond to my assessment, we heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside our building. Through the window, I could see a small convoy of black SUVs, with official municipal license plates, along with what appeared to be a luxury coach bus bearing the Metropolitan Transit Authority logo. What's all that? Robert asked, moving to the window to get a better view of the vehicle. That, I said, checking my watch, would be your transportation to the airport. James Rodriguez, our Director of Operations, is personally overseeing your departure arrangements this morning. As if on cue, there was a professional knock at our door. I opened it to find James standing in the hallway wearing his formal MTA uniform and carrying a leather portfolio. Behind him, I could see two other Transit Authority officials and what appeared to be an airport liaison representative. Good morning, Director Chen, James said with the kind of respectful formality he used during official functions. We're ready to escort your family to the airport whenever they're prepared to depart. Thank you, James. I'd like you to meet my husband Marcus and his family. Everyone, this is James Rodriguez, our Director of Operations. He's been coordinating your departure arrangements this morning. James stepped forward with professional courtesy, shaking hands with each family member as I introduced them. It's my pleasure to meet you all. Director Chen has told us so much about your visit to our city. We want to make sure your departure experience reflects the level of service we provide to families of our senior leadership. Patricia looked bewildered by the formal treatment and the obvious deference James was showing to me. Ms. Rodriguez, this is all very kind, but we really don't need any special arrangements. We're perfectly happy to take regular public transportation to the airport. Oh, but Director Chen specifically requested that we provide you with our VIP departure service, James replied smoothly. She felt that after a week of experiencing our standard passenger services, you should have the opportunity to see what our transportation network can accomplish when we provide the full range of our capability. Robert, who was still processing the implications of my professional status, asked the question that was probably bothering him most. Mr. Rodriguez, when you say VIP service, what exactly does that involve? James consulted his portfolio with the kind of practiced professionalism that characterized all of his interactions with city officials and dignitaries. Well, sir, we'll be providing escort transportation to the airport via luxury coach, with real-time traffic coordination to ensure optimal travel times. Our airport operations team has coordinated with TSA and airline personnel to expedite your check-in and security process. You'll have access to our municipal VIP lounge while waiting for your flight, and our airport liaison will personally ensure that any last-minute needs are addressed promptly. The level of service James was describing was normally reserved for visiting mayors, federal transportation officials or major municipal donors. The fact that Marcus's family was receiving this treatment solely because of their connection to me was sending a clear message about my status within the city government hierarchy. Director Chen, James continued, turning to address me directly. The mayor's office asked me to convey their appreciation for your family's visit to our city. They've prepared a small gift package, highlighting some of our recent transportation achievements that they thought your guests might find interesting. Marcus looked stunned by the mention of the mayor's office. Sarah, the mayor knows about our family visit. The mayor knows that I've been hosting family members who were critical of our transportation services, I replied. She felt it was important to demonstrate the level of excellence we can achieve when our systems are properly supported and coordinated. This was actually true, though I'd presented the situation to the mayor as an opportunity to showcase our capabilities rather than as a personal matter. Mayor Thompson had been supportive of my initiatives as transit director and was always looking for opportunities to highlight the improvements we'd made to city infrastructure under her administration. James gestured toward the vehicles waiting outside. Whenever you're ready to depart, we have everything prepared for your comfortable journey to the airport. Patricia looked around the group uncertainly, clearly overwhelmed by the level of attention and service they were receiving. Sarah, this is all very generous, but it seems like an enormous amount of trouble to go to for a simple airport trip. It's no trouble at all, I assured her. This is actually a fairly standard level of service for visiting dignitaries or family members of senior city officials. I thought you should experience what public transportation can look like when it's properly funded, professionally managed, and efficiently coordinated. The emphasis I placed on properly funded and professionally managed was intended to remind them of their criticisms about government waste and bureaucratic inefficiency. They were about to experience firsthand what competent public sector management could accomplish when it had adequate resources and clear authority. Jessica, who was still processing everything she'd learned about my professional status, asked a question that showed she was beginning to understand the broader implications of the situation. Sarah, when we complained about route efficiency and service delays during our visit, were we essentially critiquing your job performance? Not essentially, I corrected. You were literally critiquing my job performance. Every route design, service schedule, and operational policy you encountered this week was implemented under my authority as executive director. David looked embarrassed by this realization. We had no idea we were being so. You weren't inappropriate, I said diplomatically. You were offering feedback as users of our services, which is valuable information for system improvement. The problem was that you were also making general statements about government inefficiency and bureaucratic incompetence, while looking directly at a senior government official whose work you were simultaneously critiquing. Robert, who had been particularly vocal in his criticism of public sector employees, looked especially uncomfortable with this reminder of his behavior. Sarah, I owe you an apology. If I had known about your position, I never would have made those comments about government workers being lazy or unaccountable. But why should my professional status matter? I asked. If your comments about government employees were unfair and inaccurate, they were unfair and inaccurate, regardless of whether you were saying them to someone who works in government. The fact that you feel the need to apologize now suggests that you recognize your statements were problematic, not that they only became problematic when you learned who you were talking to. This observation clearly made Robert uncomfortable, as it forced him to confront the fact that his criticisms of public sector workers had been based on prejudice rather than actual knowledge of government operation. He was apologizing not because he'd been wrong about government efficiency, but because he'd discovered that his audience was more important than he'd realized. James stepped forward diplomatically, sensing that the conversation was becoming increasingly tense. Director Chen, shall we proceed with the departure arrangements? I want to ensure that your family has adequate time for all the airport services we've coordinated. Of course, I agreed. Everyone, please gather your luggage. James and his team will take excellent care of you for the remainder of your journey. As Marcus's family collected their belongings, I could see them exchanging glances and whispered comments about everything they'd learned. The revelation of my professional status had fundamentally altered their understanding of our family dynamic and their own behavior during the visit. They were beginning to realize that their week of casual dismissal and criticism had been directed at someone whose expertise and authority they hadn't even bothered to investigate. Marcus approached me as his family prepared to leave. Sarah, I need to apologize for not defending you this week, and for not making sure my family understood what you do and how accomplished you are. Marcus, the problem isn't that your family didn't understand my accomplishment. The problem is that they treated someone they believed was ordinary with casual disrespect and exclusion. If their behavior toward me changes now only because they've learned about my professional status, that tells me their apologies are about embarrassment rather than genuine recognition that they behaved poorly. He nodded slowly, understanding that we had much deeper issues to address than his family's ignorance about my career. When I get back from the airport, we need to have a serious conversation about our marriage and how we move forward from here. Yes, we do, I agree. But first, your family needs to complete their departure experience and understand what they've learned about assumptions, respect, and the consequences of treating people based on limited information. As James led Marcus's family toward the waiting vehicles, I watched from our window as they experienced the kind of professional, courteous service that reflected competent public sector management. The contrast between this treatment and their week of complaints about government inefficiency would not be lost on them, just as the revelation of my identity would force them to reconsider every assumption they'd made about my worth and capability. Patricia paused at the door of the luxury coach, looking back toward our building with an expression that suggested she was still processing everything that had happened. In the space of 30 minutes, her understanding of our family dynamic and her own behavior had been completely upended. The quiet daughter-in-law she'd been dismissing all week had revealed herself to be one of the most powerful people in municipal government, and every criticism they'd made about public transportation had been directed at the woman they'd been excluding from family activity. As the convoy pulled away from our building, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I was glad that Marcus's family would finally understand who they'd been dealing with, but I was also aware that this revelation marked a fundamental change in all of our relationships. There would be no going back to the casual dismissal and comfortable assumptions that had characterized their treatment of me for years. The question now was whether this experience would lead to genuine respect and inclusion, or whether their newfound attention would be based solely on recognition of my professional status and authority. Either way, they would never again be able to treat me as if I were insignificant or unworthy of consideration. I spent the rest of the morning thinking about the conversation I would need to have with Marcus when he returned from the airport, and about the changes that would need to occur in our marriage if we were going to build a partnership based on mutual respect, rather than his passive acceptance of his family's treatment of me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own story rather than simply accommodating other people's assumptions about who I was and what I deserved. It was a feeling I intended to maintain regardless of what happened next. The apartment felt unnaturally quiet after the convoy departed with Marcus's family. I stood at the window watching the vehicles disappear around the corner, carrying my husband and his relatives toward what would undoubtedly be the most eye-opening airport experience of their lives. For the first time in a week, I was alone in my own home, free from the constant undercurrent of criticism and dismissal that had characterized every interaction with my in-laws. I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled at my kitchen table with my laptop, intending to catch up on some work emails while Marcus was away. But concentration proved impossible as my mind kept drifting to the expressions on his family's faces when they learned who I really was. The shock, confusion, and dawning embarrassment had been exactly what I'd expected, but seeing it play out in real time had been more emotionally complex than I'd anticipated. There was satisfaction in finally revealing the truth, in watching their assumptions crumble as they realized the scope of their misjudgments. But there was also a deeper sadness about the necessity of the revelation itself. The fact that I'd had to use my professional authority to command the respect that should have been offered freely as a basic human courtesy highlighted everything that was wrong with our family dynamic. My phone buzzed with a text message from James updating me on the family's departure experience. Currently en route to airport, passengers are very quiet, asking lots of questions about MTA operations and your background. Airport liaison confirms VIP lounge access and expedited processing are ready. We'll provide full debrief after departure. I smiled at the image of Marcus's family sitting in stunned silence in the luxury coach, probably trying to process everything they'd learned and figure out how to respond to their dramatically altered understanding of our relationship. They'd spent years treating me like an afterthought, confident in their assessment of my limited importance and capability. Now they were discovering that their casual dismissals had been directed at someone whose decisions affected millions of people and whose expertise was recognized throughout the transportation industry. 20 minutes later, my phone rang with a call from Mayor Thompson herself. Linda Thompson had been mayor for 6 years, and we'd developed a strong working relationship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to improving city infrastructure. She was one of the few political leaders I'd met who genuinely understood the complexity of transportation planning and appreciated the technical expertise required to manage large-scale urban systems. "Sarah," she said without preamble, "James Rodriguez called to brief me on this morning's VIP departure service. I have to say, I'm both impressed by your restraint and amused by the poetic justice of the situation." "Good morning, Linda. I hope we didn't overreach with the level of service we provided. I know municipal resources should be used judiciously. Are you kidding? This was perfect public relations for the city and the MTA. When word gets out that we provide this level of service to visiting family members of senior officials, it reinforces our reputation for professionalism and competence. Plus, I understand your in-laws have been particularly vocal critics of our public transportation system." "That's an understatement," I confirmed. "They've spent the week explaining how everything could be managed more efficiently and criticizing the competence of government employees in general." Mayor Thompson laughed, a sound that carried genuine amusement rather than malice. "Well, I suspect their perspective on municipal government may have evolved somewhat this morning. James tells me they seemed quite surprised to learn about your actual position and responsibilities. Surprised would be a polite way to put it. I think thunderstruck might be more accurate." "Sarah, can I ask why you kept your professional identity hidden from them for so long? I mean, being executive director of the MTA isn't exactly a secret position. Your name is on official reports and public documents. You speak at conferences and testify before legislative committees." The question was one I'd been asking myself repeatedly over the past few days. Why had I allowed Marcus's family to remain ignorant about my career for so long? Why had I prioritized their comfort over my own recognition and respect? I think I convinced myself that keeping my professional life separate would allow our personal relationships to develop more authentically, I said slowly, working through my thoughts as I spoke. I wanted to be valued for my character and personality, rather than my title and authority. But somewhere along the way, that approach enabled a dynamic where they felt comfortable treating me with casual disrespect because they assumed I was powerless to object. "That's a generous interpretation of their behavior," Mayor Thompson observed. "It sounds to me like they were perfectly happy to make assumptions about your worth, based on your quiet demeanor and your husband's vague descriptions of your work." "You're probably right. I think I gave them too much credit for good intentions and not enough accountability for their impact." "Well, regardless of their motivations, today's experience should provide them with some valuable perspective on the dangers of underestimating people based on surface appearances." How did Marcus react to all of this? That was the question I'd been dreading, because it forced me to confront the most painful aspect of this entire situation. Marcus's failure to defend me or correct his family's misconceptions hadn't been an oversight or a momentary lapse in judgment. It had been a consistent pattern of prioritizing his family's comfort over his wife's dignity. Marcus has some serious thinking to do about his role in perpetuating these dynamics, I said diplomatically. I'm not sure he fully understood how his passivity was affecting our marriage until this morning. "Sarah, I hope you know that you have my complete support as you work through these personal challenges. You're one of the most competent and dedicated public servants I've ever worked with, and anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve your accommodation." After ending the call with Mayor Thompson, I spent the next hour reviewing reports from our morning rush hour operations, immersing myself in the familiar rhythms of system management and performance analysis. This was the work that had always given my life structure and purpose, the daily challenge of coordinating thousands of moving parts to serve millions of passengers efficiently and safely. Reading through the operational summaries, I was reminded of why I loved this job despite its constant pressures and public scrutiny. Every day our system enabled teachers to get to classrooms, medical workers to reach hospitals, students to attend universities, and families to visit loved ones. The routes we designed and the schedules we maintained were the invisible infrastructure that made urban life possible for people across our metropolitan area. It was ironic that Marcus's family had spent a week criticizing these very systems while benefiting from them at every turn. They'd complained about crowded conditions during peak hours without recognizing that high ridership indicated successful service. They'd grumbled about transfer requirements without understanding the mathematical principles that made comprehensive coverage possible within budget constraints. They'd noticed maintenance issues on older vehicles without appreciating the systematic fleet replacement programs that kept our overall service reliability among the highest in the nation. Most frustrating was their assumption that any problems they encountered were evidence of incompetence or inefficiency rather than the inevitable challenges of managing complex urban infrastructure with limited resources. They'd approached our transportation system as consumers entitled to perfect service, rather than citizens participating in a shared public resource that required both investment and reasonable expectations. My phone buzzed with another update from James. Family has arrived at airport. Airport Authority Director personally greeting them at curbside. TSA expedited screening arranged. VIP lounge access confirmed. Passengers still asking questions about your career background and MTA operation. I could only imagine the conversation happening in that VIP lounge as Marcus's family tried to reconcile everything they'd learned with their previous assumptions about my capabilities and importance. They were probably searching their memories for clues they'd missed, moments when my expertise had been evident, but they'd been too focused on their own preconceptions to note. The irony was that there had been plenty of opportunities for them to understand my professional background, if they'd simply shown interest in my life beyond my role as Marcus's wife. I'd never actively hidden my career, I just hadn't forced conversations about it when they seemed disinterested. When they asked vague questions about my work, I'd given brief answers rather than elaborate explanations, interpreting their lack of follow-up questions as evidence that they weren't curious about the detail. Looking back, I could see how my natural inclination toward modesty had been misinterpreted as evidence that my work wasn't particularly important or challenging. Because I didn't dominate dinner conversations with stories about my professional achievements or demand recognition for my expertise, they'd concluded that I probably didn't have achievements worth recognizing. This pattern reflected a broader problem in how professional women, particularly those in technical or administrative fields, were often perceived and valued. Society seemed more comfortable with women who promoted themselves aggressively than with those who demonstrated competence quietly. The assumption was that truly accomplished women would demand attention and recognition, so any woman who didn't must not have much to promote. My grandmother had taught me that competence spoke for itself, but she'd lived in a different era when professional relationships developed over longer time periods, and reputation could be built gradually through consistent performance. In today's world of quick judgments and surface-level interactions, perhaps quiet competence was more easily overlooked or dismissed. Around noon, Marcus returned from the airport, looking emotionally drained and somewhat shell-shocked. He dropped his keys on the side table with the same heavy gesture he'd used the previous evening, but this time his expression suggested that he'd spent the past few hours confronting some uncomfortable truths about himself and his family. How was the departure? I asked, though his expression already told me most of what I needed to know. Educational, he said, settling into his usual chair with obvious exhaustion. Very, very educational. I'm glad to hear it. Did your family have any comments about the level of service they received? Marcus laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. Comments? Sarah, they barely spoke for the entire ride to the airport. When they did talk, it was to ask James questions about your background and career achievement. They kept acting like they'd been lied to about who you were, as if someone had deliberately misled them rather than them just never bothering to ask. And what did James tell them? Everything. Your education, your previous positions, your major accomplishments as director, the recognition you've received from professional organizations. By the time we got to the airport, they understood that they'd spent a week criticizing the work of someone who's considered an expert in transportation planning and urban infrastructure management. I waited for him to continue, sensing that there was more to the story. At the airport, things got even more intense. The VIP treatment was unlike anything they'd ever experienced. personal escort through security, private lounge access, priority boarding coordination. The airport authority director spent 20 minutes explaining how much the city values your leadership and how your innovations have improved ground transportation connections. Marcus paused, running his hands through his hair in that familiar gesture of stress and confusion. Sarah, my parents kept asking me why I'd never told them about your actual job responsibilities. They couldn't understand how I could be married to someone so accomplished and never mention it to my family. And what did you tell them? I told them the truth, that I'd never really understood the scope of your position myself, that when you mentioned work challenges or achievements, I listened politely but didn't ask follow-up questions, that I'd gotten comfortable with a surface-level understanding of your career because it was easier than trying to grasp the complexity of what you actually do. This admission was both painful and encouraging. Painful because it confirmed that my husband had been as disinterested in my professional life as his family had been, but encouraging because it suggested he was finally recognizing the problem and taking responsibility for his role in creating it. How did your family respond to that? They were horrified, not just because they'd misjudged you, but because they realized that I'd failed you as a husband. My mother actually said that if I couldn't be bothered to understand and appreciate my wife's accomplishments, how could I expect them to? That was surprisingly insightful from Patricia, and it suggested that the morning's revelations had prompted some genuine self-reflection rather than just embarrassment about being caught in their assumption. Dad pulled me aside while we were waiting for their flight, and told me that he'd spent his whole life judging people too quickly, but that this situation had made him realize how much damage that kind of thinking can cause. He said he was ashamed of how he'd talked about government workers in front of you, and even more ashamed that I'd let him do it. Robert's recognition of his own prejudices was encouraging, though I wondered whether his remorse would translate into lasting changes in how he approached people and situations he didn't immediately understand. What about Jessica and David? Jessica kept saying that she couldn't believe she'd excluded you from family conversations about your own areas of expertise. She remembered some of the comments you'd tried to make about transportation and urban planning, and she realized that she'd dismissed insights from someone who actually knew what she was talking about. And David was probably the most affected. You know how he approaches everything through cost-benefit analysis? He spent the morning calculating the economic impact of the systems you manage and the level of responsibility that represents. He kept saying that he couldn't understand how he'd failed to recognize that level of competence and authority. It was gratifying to hear that Marcus's family was grappling seriously with the implications of their behavior, but I was also aware that initial shock and embarrassment didn't necessarily lead to permanent changes in attitude or behavior. The real test would be whether their newfound appreciation for my accomplishments translated into genuine respect for me as a person, or whether they would simply adjust their treatment of me based on recognition of my professional status. Marcus, there's something I need you to understand about this morning's revelation, I said, choosing my words carefully. I didn't arrange that VIP departure experience to show off or to make your family feel bad about their assumption. I did it to demonstrate what competent public sector management looks like when it has adequate resources and clear authority. He nodded slowly, probably beginning to understand that there had been deeper principles at stake than just family dynamic. Your family spent the week criticizing government inefficiency and bureaucratic incompetence, while experiencing the results of exactly that kind of management. They complained about systems that were actually performing quite well given their constraints, and they dismissed the expertise of people like me based on political prejudices rather than actual knowledge. I'm starting to understand that, Marcus said quietly, and I'm starting to realize that my failure to defend you wasn't just about family relationships. It was about allowing my wife's professional expertise to be dismissed and degraded by people who had no basis for their opinion. This recognition was important because it moved our conversation beyond personal hurt feelings to the broader question of respect for expertise and competence in public service. Marcus was beginning to understand that his family's behavior hadn't just been socially awkward, it had been fundamentally unfair to someone who dedicated her career to public service. There's something else we need to discuss, I continued. This morning's experience has clarified some things for me about our marriage and what I need going forward. Marcus's expression became more serious, probably sensing that we were approaching the most difficult part of our conversation. For 5 years, I've been accommodating a family dynamic that consistently excluded and dismissed me. I've been patient with your reluctance to defend me or correct your family's misconceptions about my work. I've accepted being treated as optional rather than integral to family gatherings and conversations. I paused, making sure he understood the gravity of what I was saying. I can't continue doing that, Mark. I can't keep accepting treatment that makes me feel invisible and unimportant just to avoid creating conflict with your family. And I can't stay married to someone who prioritizes his family's comfort over his wife's dignity. The words hung in the air between us, representing a fundamental shift in the terms of our relationship. I wasn't issuing an ultimatum exactly, but I was making clear that the status quo was no longer acceptable. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked, his voice heavy with the recognition that our marriage was at a crossroads. "I need you to understand that this isn't just about your family learning to treat me better. This is about you becoming the kind of partner who values and protects what we've built together. I need you to be genuinely interested in my work and my goals, not just politely tolerant of them. I need you to defend me when others treat me poorly, even if that creates temporary discomfort for you." Marcus was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the changes I was describing. These weren't small adjustments to our relationship. They were fundamental shifts that would require him to examine his own behavior and priorities. "Sarah, I want to be that kind of partner for you. I want to be someone who appreciates your accomplishments and protects your dignity, but I'm going to need help understanding how to make those changes. I've gotten comfortable with patterns of behavior that I didn't even realize were harmful." "That's a start," I acknowledged. "But Marcus, wanting to change isn't the same as actually change. I need to see evidence over time that you're committed to being a different kind of husband." "What would that evidence look like?" I'd been thinking about this question since our conversation the previous evening, trying to identify concrete behaviors that would demonstrate genuine change rather than just good intentions. "It means showing real interest in my work, asking questions about my challenges and achievements, learning enough about transportation planning to have meaningful conversations about what I do. It means defending me when others make dismissive comments about government workers or bureaucratic efficiency. It means insisting that I be included in family activities and treating my preferences as equally important to everyone else's." I paused, making sure he understood that these weren't suggestions but requirements. "Most importantly, it means recognizing that my professional expertise and personal worth aren't dependent on other people's recognition or approval. You need to value me for who I am and what I contribute, regardless of whether your family or anyone else understands or appreciates those qualities." Marcus nodded, though I could see the uncertainty in his expression. Change was always difficult, especially when it required examining long-standing patterns of behavior and their underlying assumptions. "How much time do I have to prove that I can make these changes?" he asked. The question suggested that he understood our marriage was now contingent on his ability to become a different kind of partner, which was both sobering and encouraging. "I don't know," I said honestly. "This isn't a test with a predetermined timeline. It's about whether you can genuinely transform how you approach our relationship and my place in your family." We were interrupted by my phone ringing with a call from James, providing a final update on the departure arrangements. "Director Chen, your family's flight departed on schedule." Before leaving, they asked me to convey their appreciation for the exceptional service and their apologies for any misunderstandings during their visit. "Thank you, James. I appreciate you handling this situation with such professionalism. Of course, I hope you don't mind me saying that this was an excellent example of how to educate people about the value and complexity of public transportation services. Your family seemed genuinely impressed by what we can accomplish when we have proper resources and coordination." After ending the call, I realized that Marcus had been listening to my conversation with obvious discomfort. He was beginning to understand that my professional relationships were characterized by mutual respect and recognition in ways that our personal relationships had never been. "Sarah," he said hesitantly, "I think I'm starting to understand how isolated you must have felt in our marriage. You have all these colleagues who value your expertise and appreciate your contributions, But at home, you've been dealing with a husband who didn't show that same level of interest or respect. That's exactly right, I confirm. It's been emotionally exhausting to switch between environments where I'm valued and environments where I'm dismissed or ignored. I'm sorry, he said, and for the first time, his apology felt like it came from genuine understanding rather than just guilt about being caught behaving poorly. I appreciate that, Marcus, but apologies aren't enough anymore. I need to see consistent changes in how you treat me and how you allow others to treat me. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about specific ways our relationship would need to change and what those changes would require from both of us. It was a difficult conversation that forced us to confront years of accumulated problems and misunderstandings, but it felt like the first honest discussion we'd had about our marriage in a very long time. By evening, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of genuine mutual respect. Marcus seemed to understand that superficial changes wouldn't be sufficient, that he needed to examine and alter fundamental aspects of how he approached our partnership. The revelation of my professional identity had forced everyone in his family to confront their assumptions about worth, competence, and respect. Whether those confrontations would lead to lasting changes in behavior remained to be seen, but at least the conversation had finally begun. I thought about my grandmother's advice about letting competence speak for itself, and I realized that sometimes speaking required using your voice rather than just hoping others would notice your work. Today had been the first time in years that I'd insisted on being seen and respected for who I really was, and it felt like the beginning of a very different kind of life. 3 days later, my phone rang with an unexpected call from Patricia. I was in my office reviewing quarterly ridership reports when her name appeared on my screen, and I felt a moment of hesitation before answering. Our relationship had been forever altered by the airport revelation, and I wasn't sure what tone this first direct conversation would take. "Sarah," she began, her voice carrying an unfamiliar note of nervousness. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important at work." The fact that she'd acknowledged my work as potentially important was itself a significant change from her previous attitude. "Not at all, Patricia. How are you settling back in at home?" "Well, that's actually why I'm calling. Robert and I have been talking non-stop since we got back, and we realized we owe you a much more substantial apology than the one we managed at the airport. We were hoping we could arrange a time to have a proper conversation about everything that happened." I leaned back in my chair watching the real-time transit display on my wall that showed hundreds of buses and trains moving through our network. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia was calling while I was literally watching the systems she'd spent a week criticizing operate in real time. "I appreciate that, Patricia. What kind of conversation are you hoping to have?" "An honest one," she said simply. "Robert and I spent the flight home going through every interaction we'd had with you over the years, and we're horrified by our own behavior. We want to understand how we became the kind of people who could treat someone so dismissively, and we want to figure out how to do better." Her words sounded genuine, but I'd learned to be cautious about accepting apologies that might be motivated more by embarrassment than by real understanding. "That sounds like important work for you to do, but I'm not sure it requires my participation. Sarah, please. We know we don't deserve your time or patience, but we're hoping you'll give us a chance to demonstrate that we're capable of growth. We've learned some painful truths about ourselves this week, and we want to share those insights with you." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't just about managing their own guilt or restoring their self-image. Patricia sounded like someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable realities about her own character, and was genuinely committed to change. "What exactly are you proposing? Could we take you to dinner? Somewhere nice? Our treat, where we can have an uninterrupted conversation about everything we've gotten wrong and what we want to do differently." The offer was tempting, though I remained skeptical about whether a single dinner could address years of accumulated dismissal and disrespect. Still, Patricia's willingness to initiate the conversation and take responsibility for arranging it suggested a level of effort that went beyond superficial damage control. "Let me think about it," I said. "Can I call you back tomorrow?" "Of course, and Sarah, thank you for even considering it. We know we haven't earned your forgiveness, but we're hoping we can at least earn the opportunity to try." After ending the call, I found myself genuinely uncertain about how to respond. Part of me was curious to hear what Marcus's parents had learned about themselves during their soul searching, but another part was wary of getting drawn into conversations that might ultimately be more about their comfort than about genuine accountability. That evening, I discussed Patricia's call with Marcus over dinner. He looked surprised by his mother's initiative but also hopeful about what it might represent. "She's been calling Jessica every day since they got home," he told me. "Apparently she's been reading articles about unconscious bias and doing research on effective apologies. She even ordered books about respectful communication and family dynamics." That's encouraging, though reading about these topics is easier than actually changing ingrained behavior patterns. True, but it's more effort than I've ever seen her put into self-reflection. Usually when mom realizes she's made a mistake, she just tries to move past it without examining what caused the problem in the first place. I considered this information while finishing my dinner. If Patricia was genuinely investing time and energy into understanding her own behavior, that suggested a level of commitment that went beyond just wanting to smooth over an awkward situation. "Marcus, what do you think she's hoping to accomplish with this dinner?" He was quiet for a moment, apparently considering the question seriously. "I think she's hoping to rebuild a relationship with you based on who you actually are rather than who she assumed you were. And I think she's hoping to prove to herself that she's capable of being a better person than she's been." "And what do you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you," he said carefully. "You don't owe my parents anything, especially not the emotional labor of helping them work through their guilt. But if you think there's a chance for genuine improvement in your relationship with them, it might be worth exploring." The next morning, I called Patricia back and agreed to have dinner with her and Robert the following weekend. She sounded genuinely grateful for my willingness to meet, and she assured me that they would come to our city rather than expecting me to travel to them. "We want to do this on your territory," she explained. "It seems appropriate given how poorly we behaved as guests in your home." On Saturday evening, Marcus and I met his parents at an upscale restaurant downtown. I'd chosen the location partly because it was convenient for me, and partly because I wanted them to experience another example of how urban infrastructure supported quality of life. The restaurant was accessible via 3 different transit lines, and its success was partly due to its location within our well-designed transportation network. Patricia and Robert looked nervous as we were seated at our table, both of them dressed more formally than usual as if they were attending an important business meeting. The effort they'd put into their appearance suggested they understood the significance of this conversation. "Sarah," Patricia began once we'd ordered our meals, "Robert and I have spent the past week doing some very uncomfortable self-examination, and we want to share what we've learned." Robert nodded, looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "We realized that our treatment of you has been consistently dismissive and exclusionary, and that this pattern reflects some ugly truths about our values and assumptions." "What kinds of truths?" I asked, genuinely curious about their self-analysis. Patricia took a deep breath before responding. "We realized that we've spent years judging people based on superficial characteristics, rather than taking time to understand who they really are. We made assumptions about your worth based on your quiet demeanor and your reluctance to promote yourself, and we never bothered to look deeper. More than that," Robert added, "we realized that we've been carrying around prejudices about government work and public service that prevented us from recognizing competence and dedication when it was right in front of us. I appreciated their willingness to acknowledge these problems, but I wanted to understand whether their insights went beyond recognition of their specific mistakes with me." "Those are important realizations," I said diplomatically. "What do you think caused you to develop those patterns of judgment?" Patricia looked uncomfortable but continued to engage with the question. "I think we've lived in a bubble for so long that we stopped challenging our own assumptions. In our social circle, everyone has similar backgrounds and similar opinions about things like government efficiency and urban living. We never had to defend our views or consider alternative perspectives. And we got lazy," Robert admitted. "It's easier to make quick judgments about people than to invest the time and energy required to really understand them. We took the path of least resistance." even when that path involved treating people unfairly. Their analysis seemed genuine and thoughtful, suggesting they'd done more than just identify their mistakes with me. They appeared to be grappling with broader questions about how they approached relationships and formed opinions about people. Sarah, Patricia continued, we want you to know that our behavior toward you wasn't just thoughtless, it was actively harmful, and we take full responsibility for the impact it had on you and on your relationship with Marcus. We also want you to know, Robert added, that learning about your professional accomplishments didn't just make us embarrassed about our assumptions. It made us recognize how much we've probably missed over the years by dismissing people too quickly. This was exactly what I'd hoped to hear because it suggested their learning extended beyond just their treatment of me to broader patterns of behavior that affected their interactions with many people. What are you planning to do with these insights? Patricia and Robert exchanged glances before Patricia responded. We're committed to changing how we approach people and situations we don't immediately understand. We're going to ask more questions, make fewer assumptions, and give people the benefit of the doubt instead of rushing to judgment. We're also going to educate ourselves about topics we've been dismissive of, Robert added. I've been reading about urban planning and public transportation, trying to understand the complexity of what you do and the challenges you face, and we want to rebuild our relationship with you based on who you actually are rather than who we thought you were. Patricia concluded, we know that will take time and consistent effort, but we're committed to doing the work. Marcus had been quiet during most of this conversation, apparently content to let his parents speak for themselves. I could see that he was carefully observing their words and demeanor, probably trying to assess whether their commitment to change was genuine. I appreciate your willingness to examine your own behavior and take responsibility for its impact, I said carefully. Change is always difficult, especially when it requires questioning fundamental assumptions about how the world works. Sarah, Patricia said, her voice carrying obvious emotion, we know we can't undo years of treating you poorly, but we want you to know that we genuinely respect and admire what you've accomplished. We want to be the kind of in-laws who support and celebrate your achievements rather than dismissing them. And we want to be better people overall, Robert added. This experience has shown us that our attitudes and behaviors have consequences for real people, and we don't want to continue causing harm through ignorance or laziness. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from their specific memories of exclusionary behavior to their plans for approaching future family gatherings differently. By the end of the evening, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of building a healthier relationship with Marcus's parents. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Jessica with the subject line, overdue apology and request for advice. She'd written a thoughtful message acknowledging her own role in excluding me from family conversations and activities. And she'd included specific examples of times when she'd dismissed my input on topics where I actually had expertise. I keep thinking about all the times you tried to contribute to discussions about urban planning or transportation policy, and how I brushed off your comments because I assumed you didn't really know what you were talking about, she wrote. I'm mortified by my own arrogance and ignorance. More importantly, Jessica had asked for my advice on a transportation project in her own community, recognizing that I might have insights that could help her navigate local political dynamics and funding challenges. This request felt like genuine acknowledgement of my expertise rather than just polite deference to my professional status. Over the following months, I watched Marcus's family work to implement the changes they'd committed to during our dinner conversation. Patricia began asking thoughtful questions about my work and showing genuine interest in my responses. Robert started sharing articles about transportation innovation that he thought might interest me, and he stopped making dismissive comments about government efficiency. Most significantly, Jessica began including me in family planning conversations and actively seeking my input on logistical decisions. When they planned their next visit to our city, she consulted with me about activities and schedules rather than assuming I would simply accommodate whatever they decided. The changes weren't perfect or immediate, but they were consistent and genuine. More importantly, they reflected a broader shift in how Marcus's family approached relationships and formed opinions about people they didn't immediately understand. Marcus himself underwent the most significant transformation. He began asking detailed questions about my work and learning enough about transportation planning to have meaningful conversations about my challenges and achievements. He started defending public service in general, and my expertise in particular, when others made uninformed criticism. Most importantly, he began treating our marriage as a true partnership where both of our perspectives and preferences mattered equally. He stopped defaulting to his family's wishes when conflicts arose, and he started actively ensuring that I was included and valued in all family activity. The morning routine where I'd once stood alone at bus stops feeling invisible and dismissed became a distant memory. Now I was someone whose expertise was recognized, whose contributions were valued, and whose dignity was protected by the people who claimed to love me. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it had required consistent effort from everyone involved. But standing in my office one afternoon, watching our transit network serve millions of passengers efficiently and safely, I felt grateful for the moment of crisis that had finally forced all of us to confront the truth about respect, assumptions, and the courage required to demand better treatment from the people in our lives. 6 months after that transformative morning at the airport, I found myself standing in the same spot where Marcus's family had left me behind, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. I was waiting for the ceremonial ribbon-cutting bus that would take city officials and community leaders to the grand opening of our new central transit hub, a project I'd been developing for 3 years that would serve as the crown jewel of our metropolitan transportation network. Marcus stood beside me wearing a suit and carrying a small folder of talking points he'd prepared about sustainable transportation initiatives. He'd volunteered to help with media relations for the event, using his marketing background to support my work in ways that felt natural and genuine rather than forced or patronizing. Watching him engage enthusiastically with reporters about bus rapid transit and electric vehicle infrastructure, I marveled at how thoroughly he'd educated himself about my field. "Director Chen," called Mayor Thompson from across the plaza, "are you ready for the most photographed bus ride of your career?" I smiled at her joke while adjusting the small microphone clip to my jacket. This event would mark not just the opening of a new facility, but the culmination of a vision I'd been working toward since taking the director position. The central hub represented everything I believed about public transportation: efficient, sustainable, accessible, and designed to serve the entire community rather than just privileged segments of the population. Patricia and Robert had flown in for the ceremony, along with Jessica, David, and the teenagers. This was their first visit since the revelations 6 months earlier, and the difference in their behavior was remarkable. Instead of complaining about using public transportation to reach the event, they'd enthusiastically ridden our new light rail line from the airport, taking photos and asking informed questions about the technology and route planning. "Sarah, this is incredible," Patricia said as she approached our group, gesturing toward the sleek glass and steel structure of the transit hub. "I've been reading about this project online, and I can't believe the scope of what you've accomplished here." Her genuine enthusiasm was still somewhat surprising to me, though I'd grown accustomed to this new version of my mother-in-law over the past month. Patricia had become one of my most vocal supporters, regularly sharing articles about transportation innovation on social media, and describing herself proudly as the mother-in-law of a transit director. Robert was deep in conversation with one of our senior engineers about the environmental impact of our electric bus fleet, asking technical questions that demonstrated he'd been doing his homework about clean transportation technology. His transformation from someone who dismissed government competence to someone who actively promoted public sector achievements had been particularly gratifying to witness. "Attention everyone," announced James Rodriguez through a portable speaker system. "The ceremonial first ride will depart in 5 minutes. Director Chen will provide commentary during our tour of the new facility." As we boarded the specially decorated bus that would take us through the hub's various levels and connections, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went beyond professional achievement. This project represented years of careful planning, political negotiation, and technical innovation, but it also symbolized my journey toward demanding and receiving the respect I deserve. The bus pulled away from the curb smoothly, its electric motor nearly silent as we entered the hub's ground level. Through the large windows, passengers could see the various transportation options available: local buses, express coaches, light rail connections, bike share stations, and ride-share pickup areas, all coordinated under one roof with real-time information displays and clear wayfinding. This facility serves as the nerve center of our regional transportation network, I said into my microphone as we rolled through the main concourse. Every mode of transit connects here, allowing passengers to move seamlessly between different services, while accessing amenities like retail, dining, and community services. Marcus's family listened attentively as I explained the various features and innovations, asking thoughtful questions that showed they understood both the technical complexity and the social importance of what we'd built. Jessica was particularly interested in the accessibility features, having become an advocate for universal design principles in her own community after learning about my work. "Sarah," said Kevin, the older of Jessica's teenagers, "my friends back home are never going to believe that my aunt built all of this. This is like something from a science fiction movie." His admiration was touching, particularly because it came from someone who'd witnessed both versions of how his family treated me. Kevin and Michelle had become some of my strongest supporters, regularly asking about my projects and sharing their own ideas about transportation solutions for young people. As our bus climbed to the second level of the hub, I pointed out the solar panel installation and energy management systems that made the facility carbon neutral. Sustainability isn't just about electric vehicles, I explained. It's about creating infrastructure that reduces environmental impact while improving quality of life for everyone in the community. Mayor Thompson nodded approvingly from her seat near the front of the bus. This project has exceeded every expectation we had when Director Chen first proposed. She's shown that visionary leadership and technical competence can transform how people think about public transportation. The mayor's public praise meant a great deal to me, but what meant even more was seeing Marcus beam with pride as she spoke. His genuine happiness about my recognition and success had become one of the most healing aspects of our relationship's transformation. After the ceremonial tour, we gathered in the hub's main plaza for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony. Local media crews captured footage as I stood with scissors in hand, flanked by Mayor Thompson and other city officials, preparing to formally open the facility to public use. "This represents more than just a transportation hub," I said to the assembled crowd. "It represents our commitment to creating infrastructure that serves everyone, that connects communities, and that demonstrates what's possible when we invest in competent public sector leadership and evidence-based policymaking." The ribbon fell away cleanly, and the crowd erupted in applause. As photographers captured the moment, I noticed Marcus's family clapping enthusiastically, their faces reflecting genuine pride in my achievement. The contrast with how they'd treated me 6 months earlier was almost surreal. Later, as we toured the facility with the first regular passengers, Patricia approached me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I keep thinking about how differently this day might have gone if we hadn't learned who you really were. We might have missed witnessing something truly historic because we were too narrow-minded to recognize greatness when it was right in front of us. Patricia, the important thing is that you were willing to change once you understood the situation. Not everyone has that capacity for growth. I hope you know that our respect for you now isn't just about your professional accomplishments," she continued. "We've learned to appreciate your character, your patience with our ignorance, and your generosity in giving us chances we probably didn't deserve." Robert joined our conversation, looking around the bustling hub with obvious admiration. "Sarah, I've been thinking about that morning when we left you at the bus stop, and I realize now that we were symbolically abandoning someone who dedicated her life to making sure people like us never get stranded. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate." His insight was more profound than I'd expected, and it showed how deeply he'd reflected on the metaphorical significance of their behavior. They'd literally left behind the person who ensured that transportation systems worked for everyone, treating her as expendable while depending entirely on her expertise and dedication. As the afternoon progressed, I watched thousands of passengers flow through the new hub, seamlessly connecting between different transit modes and accessing services that would improve their daily lives. Elderly residents used the accessible elevators and clear signage to navigate between buses and medical appointments. Students transferred from suburban express services to light rail lines that would take them to universities downtown. Families with young children appreciated the clean restrooms, comfortable waiting areas, and real-time arrival information that made travel with kids more manageable. Every element of the facility reflected principles I'd spent years advocating for: universal design, environmental responsibility, economic efficiency, and social equity. But watching it come to life with actual passengers using it for their real transportation needs felt more rewarding than any professional recognition or award ceremony. Marcus appeared beside me as I stood observing the flow of travelers through the main concourse. "Penny, for your thought," he asked with a smile. "I'm thinking about how this all started with your family leaving me at a bus stop," I said. If someone had told me that morning that it would lead to this moment, I never would have believed them. "Do you regret how everything unfolded? The confrontation, the revelation, all the difficult conversations that followed?" I considered his question carefully. The past 6 months had been emotionally challenging as we'd all worked to rebuild relationships and establish new patterns of behavior. There had been setbacks and uncomfortable moments as people struggled to implement the changes they'd committed to making. "No, I don't regret it," I said finally. "I regret that it took such a dramatic moment to force the conversations we should have been having all along. But I don't regret finally demanding the respect I deserved. I'm grateful it happened," Marcus said quietly. "Not because I enjoyed watching my family embarrass themselves, but because it forced me to confront how badly I'd been failing you as a husband. I needed that wake-up call even though it was painful." Looking around the transit hub filled with people whose lives were being improved by infrastructure I'd designed and implemented, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional achievement. This facility represented my values made concrete: the belief that competent public service could improve people's lives, that infrastructure should serve everyone, rather than just the privileged, and that expertise and dedication deserved recognition and respect. "Marcus," I said, taking his hand as we watched the evening commuter rush begin to flow through our new facility, "I think we've both learned some important lessons about the difference between being loved for who people think you are, and being loved for who you actually are." He squeezed my hand gently, and I've learned that being a good husband means more than just avoiding conflict. It means actively protecting and celebrating what we've built together. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows through the hub's glass walls, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been someone who accommodated disrespect to avoid conflict, who hid her accomplishments to maintain relationships, who accepted exclusion rather than demand inclusion. Tonight, I was someone who'd learned to value herself appropriately, who'd insisted on being treated with dignity, and who'd discovered that real love and respect could withstand the discomfort of honest conversations and necessary change. The Central Transit Hub would serve millions of passengers over the coming decades, but for me, it would always represent something more personal: the moment when I finally stopped hiding my light under a bushel and started insisting that the people in my life see and appreciate who I really was. Standing in the facility I'd dreamed, designed, and built, surrounded by family members who now genuinely valued my contributions and supported my ambitions, I felt complete in a way I'd never experienced before. The quiet government worker who'd been left at a bus stop had revealed herself to be someone whose work mattered, whose expertise deserved respect, and whose dignity was non-negotiable. Sometimes the most powerful revelations come not from gaining something new, but from finally claiming what was always rightfully yours. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.